So let's take a look at what's going on in London in particular, because that is, after all, where Shakespeare is writing plays and where his plays are being performed during the Elizabethan age. So Elizabeth is in charge, and we are developing this sort of embrace of all things English. England's becoming a world power and an economic power. And so we need to kind of think about one of the things that's happening, which is in London, this city is exploding. As the economy gets rolling, people move in large numbers from the countryside into England at the time. In the last 20 years of the 1600s, so we're talking, or the 1500s, talking about 1580 to 1600, the population doubles, 100,000 to 200,000 people. And then in the next 50 years, it doubles again. So by 1650, England is 400,000 people. Nationally, during this period, the population only grows 20%, but here is London just exploding in terms of how many people are there. Now, these numbers are really abstract, right? 100,000 to 200,000 people in 10 years. What does that mean? And what does it actually end up looking like? Well, here's an equivalent. I took a map of Muncie, and here is a rectangle of Muncie that represents roughly the size of London, England proper in the Elizabethan era, right? So this is where all the numbers I'm talking about are happening. This is a 3 mile by 2 mile rectangle. We've got up in the upper left-hand corner, there's McGalliard's, like the McDonald's is up there, and at the right-hand corner, you see the mall, and then this is downtown Muncie, and the right-hand side, there's Ball State in the middle. So you get an idea of kind of the territory covered. Now, let me give you some numbers here. Right now, Muncie has a population of 67,000 people. Ball State has 20,000 students. So there are 87,000 people living in the Muncie area. Not this rectangle that I've outlined here. There's a lot of those 87,000 who live outside of this rectangle. So let's just take a wild stab at it and say, I don't know, there are 50,000, maybe 25 or 30,000 people living inside this rectangle. Right? We can come to a number somewhere between 30 and 50,000. If this was London, we would have between 100 and 200,000 people. So the next time you walk around this area, imagine for every person you see, instead there are 2 or 4 people. That is an incredibly busy, densely packed city. There are a lot of people. They are close to one another. They're living in some pretty awful living conditions in a variety of different ways. Remember, guys, this is before the era of sewers, as one of many modern indoor conveniences that don't even remotely exist in Elizabethan London. It's crowded, it's busy, but it is also getting wealthier. As the economy of London gets rolling, we have 2 developing groups that start making quite a lot of money. International trade and the opportunity for people to buy international goods creates a middle class of merchants and traders. These are basically white-collar people who don't get their hands dirty when they work, but they are wealthy. They're of the middle class. They're not nobles. They are not people who have land and a title, but they are people who, started the business, and there aren't that many of them, but they are there in numbers significant enough to have an impact on the London economy and the London theater scene, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then we also have lots and lots and lots of skilled laborers, right? People like blacksmiths and carpenters and shipwrights and people who belong to a trade guild, as we talked about in the medieval era. Both of these groups, the rising middle class and the relatively comfortable working class, have disposable income. A little bit, right? Anytime we have an economic boom period, we get a little bit of extra disposable income. You shove all those people packed into this very tight, dense city, give them some cash, which they're earning, right? And you've got a market for commercial and, importantly, competitive entertainment. And here's a historical image of what some of those entertainments might have looked like. This is an image of the Globe. We'll talk about that in a later lecture. But it's important to remember that Shakespeare is writing to make money more than he is to make our idea of high art. And that's a conversation we can have in class, but it's just an important thing to remember, and then to ask yourself about every Shakespearean play you read, and Othello in particular for this class. Why is this a perfect play for this audience and entertainment market? Why does Othello make money? Because look, if you're going to go see Othello at the Globe, you have that choice, and you have about 4 other theaters that are open at the same time. You could go see those instead. In addition to the theaters, there are all kinds of other sorts of entertainments going on. You could go see those instead. Othello is a commercial product. It must draw an audience. How does it do that? Then, Let's talk about what I'm going to refer to as sort of educational or mental context. This is, again, the development of Englishness in a handful of different ways. First off, one of the things that distinguishes England from much of the rest of Europe is that nearly all kids, poor, working class, middle class, upper class, all kids go to grammar school at some point. And that is simply the equivalent of like elementary school up through maybe middle school in our common understanding of it. They go 6 days a week. They go 10 hours a day. They are in school a lot. And the basis for grammar school is Latin. So you learn not only English, right, but you learn Latin, and you learn it by memorizing it and repeating it. How come? You can't afford books. Your school can't afford textbooks. It can't afford paper. So you speak things out loud and you repeat them out loud. And you were called on in the middle of your school classroom to recite all of the verb conjugations of a given word. And you got to say it out loud. And when you read something, you don't necessarily have it as a book in front of you. It is frequently read to you, and then you're asked to memorize it. What we're getting here is, right, that verbally and from a memorization standpoint, a lot of the mental and educational context take place in your mind, not written out on paper and not visual. The growth of the university system gives us a whole lot of different things. First off, as I mentioned earlier, educated people with philosophical, intellectual, and humanist ideas outside of the bounds of religion. And again, Elizabeth being a liberal monarch allows for those things to happen. The other thing we get is playwrights who have gone to college. We get playwrights who have gone to college, studied the Greek and Roman texts and ideas and plays and concepts, and are also generally broadly educated in that liberal arts sense about the world. You get a secular humanist group of playwrights. Shakespeare himself did not go to college, interestingly enough, but many of the other playwrights of his era did, and that university system has a big impact on playwriting in this era. Generally speaking, grammar school and the university system result in kind of a shockingly high rate of literacy in London, at least where men are concerned. I'll talk about women later. Here's what I mean by this. Think about a London apprentice, right? This is a young working class kid who's like 13 or 14-ish, right? Well, it could actually be anywhere from 11 or 12 all the way up to 17 or 18. But it's a young, almost always working class kid who is, training to become a shipwright or a blacksmith or et cetera, et cetera. Here's what we know about the time. Only 18% of those kids couldn't sign their own name. That is a really high rate of the ability to write out your own name. So that's one of the many pieces of evidence that tells us that, generally speaking, London men, even the working class men, were shockingly literate. Here's another group that is sort of the lowest of the working class, and those are servants. These are people who are not skilled laborers. They are just servants to the nobles, and there are lots of them. Only 31% of servants are unable to sign their name. So again, right, 69% of servants who really have very little education, some grammar school, right, but have no motivation to be educated, they can still read and write reasonably well. It's fairly impressive. We have then a literary culture. And as we noted in grammar school, and because nobody can afford a book, not the regular everyday person, the literary nature of that culture is expressed verbally. And I want to contrast this to what we saw in the Italian Renaissance, where the wealthy nobles of Italy embraced much of the visual culture of what was going on in Greece and Rome. And they reproduced lavish, ornate, flat, three-dimensional painted backdrops and ridiculous sort of scenic excess in their set design. That's going on in Italy. Here in England, we are embracing an intellectual and artistic philosophical culture that we express by talking. You know anything about England, the language and English verbal wit is a huge part of what it means to be English, and these are a lot of the places where those ideas come from. So it's kind of a big deal. Along those lines, in terms of educational mental contexts, there is a huge flexibility and growth of the English language. And just for context here, we tend to think of any language, as something that's fixed. It's written down, it's in the dictionary sits on the shelf, and those are the words. And there's some words that exist outside of that, but not really. As English develops as a language, it's super flexible, and there really isn't any sort of set list of words. There is no dictionary that is definitive and absolute. This means that with a Latin base in your education, there are all sorts of opportunities to just simply make up words. You know who did that? This guy. Here is an example of words that did not exist in the English language until they were written down in a Shakespearean play. So as far as we know, Shakespeare was the first person to use the word antipathy. Frugal, dwell, vast, excellent. Some of these are not terribly complicated words. He just made them up. Eventful, countless, indistinguishable, lonely, barefaced. What I'm getting at here is this is a great time to be a playwright because you're in a country and a city that expresses its culture verbally and you can make up words. The ones I have listed up here, there are more than 2,035 total words that did not appear anywhere in the English language until they appeared in a Shakespearean play. That effectively means that Shakespeare either made them up or was the first person to write them down. He changed the English language. There are 600 new words in Hamlet alone. So here's a guy who is working at the height of his powers in a time when it's really good to be a writer. In addition to words, the flexibility and growth of the English language, you can also make up phrases. Here are just a handful of phrases that were not seen anywhere before Shakespeare wrote them down. Cold comfort, one fell swoop, vanish into thin air, play fast and loose, flesh and blood, foregone conclusion, foul play, and in a pickle. And just as the previous example, this is just a small sampling of the numerous common everyday words and phrases, common and everyday to us, that Shakespeare just invented. What we get out of this, then, is a time where high literacy, the ability to verbally express the culture and to memorize it, and then the ability to make up words gives us a huge opportunity for writing beautiful, intricate, complex plays that your audience is going to be able to understand, even the blacksmiths, even the servants. So as you read Othello, show me, where does the language of this play reflect and fit the mental and educational context of his audience? How is this play written for people who are, even the working class, literarily minded? Where do you see examples of that beautiful but complex writing? And that ends segment 2.